The architecture behind modern power. Power no longer announces itself. It doesn't wear uniforms or issue decrees. It hides inside systems, flows through incentives, and shapes outcomes long before anyone realizes a decision was made. Today, power is less about who gives orders and more about who designs the structure. To understand why this matters now, we have to stop looking at leaders and start looking at architecture. Because in the modern world, the most influential forces don't command behavior. They make certain behaviors inevitable. For most of history, power was visible. Kings ruled by force. Governments enforced laws. Corporations issued directives. Authority had a face, a voice, and a location. If something went wrong, people knew where to point. Control was centralized, and resistance had a target. The reveal begins when systems replace command with design. Instead of telling people what to do, modern power defines the environment in which choices are made. Platforms don't force engagement. They reward it. Markets don't demand risk-taking. They price safety out of reach. Algorithms don't silence voices. They simply amplify some and ignore others. Architecture does the work quietly. Rules are embedded upstream, long before outcomes appear. By the time people act, the path of least resistance is already set. Choice still exists, but it exists inside boundaries shaped by incentives, defaults, and constraints no one voted on. This is why modern power feels invisible. There is no single authority to confront, no order to disobey. The system never says no. It just makes some options frictionless and others exhausting. Over time, behavior converges without coercion. As digital systems scale globally, this architectural power multiplied. A single design decision now affects millions. A small parameter change reshapes entire ecosystems. Influence moves at the speed of deployment, not legislation. And once embedded, architecture is harder to challenge than authority ever was. What makes this shift unsettling is not that power still exists. It's that it operates best when no one notices it at all. As architectural power expanded, its effects became easier to feel than to explain. Outcomes repeated across different contexts, cultures, and industries, even when intentions varied. People made choices freely, yet those choices converged toward the same results. The structure was doing the deciding. The conflict emerged when accountability began to blur. When power operates through architecture, responsibility becomes difficult to assign. No one explicitly ordered the behavior. No policy mandated the outcome. The system simply made certain actions easier, safer, or more rewarding than alternatives. And when things went wrong, there was no clear decision-maker to confront. This shift transformed how control was exercised. Platforms claimed neutrality, pointing to user choice. Markets claimed objectivity, pointing to prices. Algorithms claimed fairness, pointing to data. Each layer deflected responsibility upward, while power flowed downward through design choices made far earlier and far away. Institutions struggled to adapt. Laws were written to regulate actions, not environments. Accountability frameworks assumed human intent, not structural inevitability. When architecture shaped behavior automatically, enforcement arrived too late. By the time outcomes were visible, the system had already trained millions to behave a certain way. People felt this tension personally. They sensed constraints without seeing walls. Burnout appeared without clear cause. Opportunities narrowed without formal exclusion. Resistance felt futile, not because it was forbidden, but because alternatives carried too much friction to sustain. Meanwhile, those who understood architecture gained quiet influence. They didn't argue for control. They designed it. Defaults became destiny. Interfaces became levers. Incentives became enforcement. Power no longer needed to persuade. It only needed to be embedded correctly. As these systems layered upon each other, architectural power compounded. A design choice in one system reinforced incentives in another. Feedback loops formed, tightening outcomes further. The system didn't need alignment meetings. It aligned behavior automatically. The deeper problem was not malice. It was invisibility. When power hides inside structure, it escapes scrutiny. And when it escapes scrutiny, it becomes harder to challenge than any authority the world had ever known. The question growing louder was no longer who holds power, It was who designs the systems that decide where power flows. As architectural power hardened, attempts to resist it began to fail in familiar ways. People tried to opt out, only to discover that alternatives carried hidden costs. Slower systems, fewer opportunities, less visibility. The architecture didn't forbid escape. It simply made leaving impractical. The conflict intensified when change itself became constrained by the very systems meant to enable it. Innovation followed existing pathways. Because deviation was expensive, new ideas were shaped to fit current incentives. Even rebellion was absorbed, monetized, and redirected back into the structure it tried to oppose. The system learned faster than its critics. This created a quiet psychological pressure. Individuals blamed themselves for outcomes they didn't fully control. If success followed the system, failure felt personal. The architecture remained invisible, while responsibility felt internal. Power worked best when people believed they were choosing freely. Institutions found themselves trapped as well. Governments tried to regulate platforms that evolved faster than law. Organizations attempted reform within systems that rewarded the status quo. Every effort to change behavior without changing architecture produced the same result: temporary noise followed by long-term reversion. Meanwhile, designers gained disproportionate influence, not because they sought power, but because they shaped defaults. A small interface decision redirected millions of actions. A parameter tweak altered economic incentives across entire networks. These choices rarely felt political, yet their consequences were profoundly so. As systems interconnected, architectural power became self-reinforcing. One design assumption fed into another. Metrics optimized systems that optimized metrics. Feedback loops narrowed behavior further, until alternatives felt unrealistic rather than forbidden. The system didn't need enforcement. It produced compliance naturally. The build-up reached a critical realization. Power had moved upstream. It no longer lived where outcomes were visible. It lived where systems were designed. And by the time people felt its effects, the architecture had already done its work. Challenging modern power no longer meant confronting authority. It meant redesigning the structures that quietly made certain futures inevitable. The turning point came when people stopped asking who was in charge and started asking how things were built. The question shifted from leadership to architecture, from authority to design. The climax revealed a stark truth. Modern power does not rely on force or persuasion. It relies on default paths. When systems are designed well, people follow them willingly, believing the outcomes are self-chosen. Control becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it feels natural. Out of this realization, a new form of resistance began to take shape. Not protest, but redesign. Not opposition, but alternative structures. Communities experimented with systems that aligned incentives with resilience rather than extraction. Designers began exposing assumptions instead of burying them. Transparency moved upstream. The resolution reframed responsibility. Power was no longer something to be seized or dismantled. It was something to be shaped carefully. Every system reflected values, whether acknowledged or not, and those values became real through behaviors they rewarded at scale. The future will not be decided by who holds authority. It will be decided by who designs the architecture beneath our choices. And in a world governed by systems, the most radical act may be to build them differently. Subscribe to join the journey. The